Hi, everyone. Let's talk about consumer protection and product safety. In this lesson, we'll describe government regulation of certain products by the USDA and FDA. We'll describe government regulation of nutrition facts and other safety information. We'll describe the federal laws that regulate product and vehicle safety. We'll identify and describe unfair and deceptive business practices. We'll describe state and local consumer protection laws. Jumping right in. So the basic of this lesson, again, is to look at laws that protect consumers. So, prior to this government regulation, a little bit more of a dangerous world. We sort of take it for granted how safe things are these days. I'm sure there are dangerous products out there, but at least there are government entities that, once those products are discovered, will take them off the marketplace. So prior to all that, sales transactions were guided by the principle of caveat emptor, which just means let the buyer beware, meaning you need to do your own research before you buy something. And if you get hurt by it, then that's just on you and you don't have very much recourse. Now, it's a much different world that we live in now, of course, because we have all these consumer protection laws. So these are federal and state statutes that promote product safety, and they also prohibit abusive, unfair, and deceptive business practices. And again, nothing's perfect. No regulatory framework is going to be perfect. But it does create a much safer world than existed prior. So looking at food safety, we have two big entities, the USDA and the FDA. So taking a look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture first, USDA, I give you a link there to their website. They're responsible for regulating meat, poultry, and other food products, mainly things like meat, poultry, and eggs. So they institute labeling requirements, what you have to put on the label. They also inspect food processing and storage facilities. Large facilities will even have full-time USDA employees who work in those facilities and constantly monitor things. The USDA does have the power to initiate legal proceedings against violators who either sell or distribute adulterated products or make false and misleading statements or labeling. So you may have seen some of these type of labels on the meat and eggs that you buy. If you have, they're supposed to maintain certain quality standards in order to be able to put that seal on there saying what type of grade this meat is or what type of grade the eggs are, things like that. That's all the USDA. This example case for adulterated food, United States versus LaGrue Distribution Systems Incorporated. This happened in 2006 in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. The defendant, LaGrue, operated a warehouse that distributed raw, fresh, and frozen meat. They knew that they had a rat problem. They were constantly setting up traps to try to catch rats. Rather than shutting down and fully addressing the rat problem, they kept operating, knowing that this problem existed. A USDA inspector came by and noticed the problem. They called in a much larger team of USDA inspectors who discovered the full scope of the rat problem and were appalled at what they found. So then it came to USDA to try to find, did LaGrue knowingly engage in the improper storage of food in violation of federal food safety laws? Well, during discovery, they were able to find meeting minutes that discussed the problem and ways to try to address it. So yeah, they knew about the problem. They didn't store food properly. They didn't properly address the rat problem. So this company faced a pretty hefty fine. The Organic Foods Protection Act, this was passed in 1990. This allows the USDA to establish a certification program for producers and handlers of agricultural products that have been produced using organic methods. Okay, so organic is one of these marketing terms that companies love to use because they think customers would like to buy products labeled as organic. So we had to set some sort of standard for what that actually means. If you don't put a standard to it, then anybody can use it, regardless of what they're doing is organic or not. So there's supposed to be a standard here set by the USDA in order to use this seal, the green circle seal that you see on the slide there. They're supposed to meet those standards in order to be able to put that label on there. So the requirements can be pretty strict and extensive. And if you end up trying to start an organic farm, then you can learn a whole lot more about it. But just following their standards to be able to put the seal on there. Okay, the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Safety Act established the organization known as the Food and Drug Administration. We often just abbreviate it the FDA. Again, I gave you a link there in the slide to the FDA website. Just as the name of the act suggests, it regulates food, drugs, and cosmetics. So provides the basis for the regulation of testing, manufacture, distribution, and sale of foods, drugs, cosmetics, and medicinal products. It also prohibits shipment, distribution, or sale of adulterated food. We'll define adulterated here in a minute. It also prohibits false and misleading labeling. Okay. Again, the organization that administers it is the FDA. Looking at adulterated food, what does it mean, adulterated? Okay, so we hear this term a lot. What does it mean? Okay, so it can mean a lot of things. It can mean it consists in whole or in part of any filthy, putrid, or decomposed substance, or if it is otherwise unfit for food, if it has been prepared, packed, or held under unsanitary conditions, if it contains an unsafe food additive, color additive, animal drug, or pesticide, chemical residue, if it contains any poisonous or deleterious substance that may render the food injurious to health, if its container is composed of any poisonous or deleterious substance that may render the food injurious to health. So the idea being that the food should be manufactured and distributed in a healthy state, relatively healthy, not poisoned or with harmful additives or any harmful other substance. We also use the term economic adulteration, which means adding a substance to increase the food's bulk or weight, to reduce its quality or strength, or to make it appear more valuable than it is. So you're not just supposed to pump a bunch of water into meat in order to make it heavier so you can charge more for it. That would be economic adulteration. When you do buy food that has water content in it, oftentimes you'll see on that label, it's supposed to be all the time on that label, you should see what percent of the water weight is there so that it's not misleading to the customer. Okay, so false and misleading labeling or packaging. So the FDCA prohibits false and misleading labeling or packaging of food products, dietary supplements, and vitamins and minerals. The manufacturer may be held liable if the food item is deemed false or misbranded, if, among other things, if the labeling is false or misleading, if the advertising is false and misleading, if the label contains an inaccurate statement of the quantity of the contents in terms of weight, measure, or numerical count, if it contains undisclosed artificial flavoring, coloring, or chemical preservatives, if the container is made, formed, or filled to be misleading, if the food quality falls below an established standard, if such a standard exists, if undisclosed words, statements, or information required by law, like nutrition information, in other words, if that label isn't on there, by failing to list the name and quantity of each ingredient for dietary supplements, or for false or misleading labeling of vitamins or minerals. The idea being that the FDA tightly regulates these nutrition labels. It tightly regulates the words you can use on packaging and labeling so that we're not misleading customers. Now, companies in their marketing attempts to try to sell more products are always trying to use the terminology they think customers are looking for. So organizations like the USDA and the FDA are trying to set standards for what certain terms mean, but not all terms have definitions. So it pays to be an informed consumer and just kind of assume that whatever words we see on packaging is marketing unless we can prove otherwise. Okay, the FDA also regulates drugs. We heard a lot about the FDA in the last several years as the United States and other countries were rushing to try to produce a vaccine for the COVID virus, the new COVID virus. So before a new medicine, a new drug can be distributed and sold in the United States, it has to go through very strictly regulated testing process to be reviewed by the FDA to make sure that this thing, whatever this substance is safe for the general population, or at least for the targeted population of the drug. The Drug Efficacy Amendment to the FDCA empowers the FDA to license new drugs in the United States. This process can take a long time. It can take years. It can take years for a pharmaceutical company to develop a new drug, more years for the testing mandated by the FDA, and it can just be a very long process. Some people think it should be shorter. The idea is to be as safe as possible, but there is always going to be room for debate as to whether or not those regulatory hurdles should be raised or lowered. They were significantly lowered for the COVID vaccine in an effort to try to get it out to the public as fast as possible. Now, as it happens, the vaccine proved to be pretty safe for the general population, so no huge die-off of humans yet. So hopefully we're in the clear with that one. But it always will cause some hesitation in the minds of people when they see that something was issued for emergency authorization or something like that. So it is something to keep in mind for sure. The FDA has the ability to revoke approval of previously licensed drugs if we find out later that we missed some side effect or something going on with that drug that would cause harm to a significant enough amount of people in the FDA. Even though a drug was approved, it can be pulled back off the market. It also prohibits the manufacture, distribution, or sale of adulterated or misbranded drugs. So whatever you say is in the bottle should be in the bottle. It shouldn't be contaminated by anything. It shouldn't be mislabeled or misbranded. As we mentioned earlier, the FDA regulates cosmetics. So some FDA requirements for cosmetics is that we have proper labeling, proper disclosure of the ingredients, and display of warnings if there are ingredients in there that are known carcinogens or otherwise dangerous to health. You are putting these substances on your skin, so it's a good thing for us to know whether those chemicals are dangerous or generally safe. Hopefully they're all very, very safe. The FDA prohibits manufacture, distribution, or sale of adulterated or misbranded cosmetics. So we'll see that line in a lot of these things that the FDA is regulating, is that it prohibits adulteration of these products, whether it be food products, cosmetics, drugs, whatever. And all that stands to reason. If we find out that some company is putting stuff in there that shouldn't be there, whether by intent or by accident, the FDA should be able to step in and remove those products from the market. The FDA can also remove from commerce any cosmetics that contain unsubstantiated claims. So again, when it comes to marketing, companies will say a lot of things. They'll say almost anything to get you to buy that product. But if we're making claims that have no evidence behind them at all whatsoever, then the FDA should have the power to go in and pull those products down, or at least make them change the label to take the unsubstantiated claims. Saying something is going to cure cancer or whatever. If there's no evidence that it will do this, or it's going to regrow your hair, or it's, whatever it's going to do. If there's no evidence to it, then you shouldn't be able to say it on the labeling. At least that's the idea. The FDA also regulates medical devices. So we're looking at things like pacemakers, dialysis machines, defibrillators, all kinds of surgical equipment, etc. Just trying to be as safe as possible. Make sure all these machines are safe for human use. The FDA is empowered to remove, quote, quack devices from the market. If we find that there's some device making all sorts of outlandish claims about the benefits that it has, and it turns out it really doesn't do anything, then the FDA does have the power to remove those. When it comes to nutrition labeling, we're all pretty familiar with nutrition labeling, or most of us are, people who are trying to watch their health. But these are on almost all the packaged products that we would find in the grocery store or, wherever you're buying your food. But most packaged food products have this nutrition label on it, listing the things that an informed consumer should know about before they consume this product. And what has to be on the label changes over time. We see revisions as we learn more things about human health and what should be on there versus what shouldn't, and what companies should or should not be able to get away with saying, so we'll see it change. But we have here an example of one of the recent revisions, the things that are supposed to be on there. So, it'll give you how many servings are there per container, what is the serving size of one serving, how many calories per serving. Then you have to list total fat, saturated fat, trans fats, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and then break down carbohydrates into fiber, sugars, and then you also have to label any sugars that were added to it versus naturally occurring sugars, protein, and then certain vitamins and minerals are required to be on there, and then the companies can list additional stuff if they want to. So the FDA sets a bar and says all this stuff has to be on there, and if you want to list more stuff, you can, but aren't required to. But anyway, most of us have seen these before. They're on almost everything. So the FDA enforces the appropriate use of food label claims. So now we're starting to get into that terminology. Some of the terminology is regulated. Some of the terminology is not. So if you're going to use terms like, and these are examples, there's a lot more to this list. I think the book has a longer list, and I'm sure there are more than even what the book lists. But things like fat-free, low-fat, sugar-free, reduced sugar, low-calorie, low cholesterol, gluten-free. These are all words that have defined definitions to them. Okay, here's how much fat can be in there per serving in order to call it low fat or fat free, or how much sugar can be in there before you can say sugar free or reduced sugar, so on and so forth. Some terms don't have any definition at all, like the term healthy or natural. So when companies like to put those terms on products for marketing purposes, the consumer, an informed consumer, should treat them as essentially meaningless, since there's no regulated definition of what they actually mean. So you can just kind of put them on there for almost anything. We've also seen, in my lifetime, we've seen probably in the past, maybe 10 years, maybe less than that, when you go to a restaurant, like a fast food restaurant, and then you see calorie counts beside the menu items. That wasn't always that way. When I was growing up, that was never a thing. We never knew how many calories were in a McDonald's hamburger. But now you can look all of that up. And restaurants with 20 or more locations have to disclose those calorie counts, whether it be right there on the menu, or you can find them oftentimes online on their websites, things like that, just so you have a better idea of just popping down to get a value meal at McDonald's or Taco Bell or whatever. What are you really getting yourself into there? Spoiler alert, it's a whole lot of calories. Okay, looking at product safety. So the Consumer Product Safety Act regulates potentially dangerous consumer products. It also created the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is the government agency that is empowered to enforce the Consumer Product Safety Act. Again, I gave you a link to their website. This is a cool website to peruse, just to see various statistics on, what products are being recalled and things like that. When you have kids, it seems like there's all the time some kid product being recalled because it's dangerous to kids. We had a bassinet that we had to get rid of because it got recalled before we ever used it, thankfully. So anyway, the CPSC adopts rules and regulations to interpret and enforce the Consumer Product Safety Act. They conduct research on the safety of consumer products. They collect data regarding injuries. They issue product safety standards, and they require recall notices to consumers. So, like I said, you buy a product, and if we find out later that it's dangerous and it's causing harm to people, then either the company voluntarily or the Consumer Product Safety Commission can require that they issue a recall so that consumers can bring that product back. They usually bring it back and are entitled to a refund, usually is how it works. Or maybe sometimes they can just fix it somehow. Speaking a little bit more about product safety, there are general use products. The CPSC regulates thousands of consumer products and issues product safety standards for products such as a very short illustrative list: furniture, appliances, lawnmowers, golf carts, really just any physical thing that you as a consumer would go buy. We differentiate this from industrial products, things that never make their way, quite to an end-use consumer. There might be different regulations for those. So we're talking pretty specifically about consumer products here, things that find their way into the hands and houses of end-use consumers. Looking more specifically, we have a lot of regulations surrounding toys and children's product, obviously, because children are much more vulnerable. They're much easier to injure, and they're not as able of being careful and protecting themselves. So they deserve a higher bar of protection. The Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, which was passed in 2008, sets new requirements for the testing and documentation of safety of products and decreases the levels of acceptable, possible, harmful substances that can be included in those products and the packaging. Only children's products and toys that are certified as meeting CPSC safety standards may be sold or distributed. This becomes pretty difficult in a marketplace, a modern marketplace that we find ourselves in, where it's really easy to go on websites like Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, wherever, and just buy tons of stuff from overseas. The idea is that they all should be certified as meeting these safety standards to be sold in the United States. You just have to be careful as a consumer what you're purchasing and who you're purchasing it from. Switching gears a little bit to automobile and vehicle safety. Now, keep in mind, as we're going over all these topics, they all are way more comprehensive than the scope of this class and this book or this chapter in this book allows. You can learn so much more. And if you find yourself in any one of these industries, you'll learn way more about whatever regulations are relevant to that particular industry or that particular product. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about all of these. We're just kind of giving you a foundation. So again, back to automobile and vehicle safety. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act regulates the safety of cars, SUVs, vans, trucks, etc. It created the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Again, a link to their website if you want to go learn more. This would be the organization that is regulating how the safety standards for cars and trucks, just general vehicle manufacture, to make them safer and safer for consumers over time. And the cars that we have, modern cars, are much, much, much safer than cars back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's improving all the time. Sometimes it takes a push from the government to actually improve these safety standards, but the reality is, with modern technology, airbags, crumple zones, things like this, and crash safety tests, we've gotten better at making vehicle crashes more survivable. I don't think we'll ever get to 100% survivable, and people still get injured and killed all the time, but much less so now, proportionally to the way it was, decades ago. Okay, unfair and deceptive practices. Throwing another organization at you here, another government agency, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. They are the agency that is empowered to enforce the Federal Trade Commission Act. This was passed in 1914, so we're going back in time compared to the other legislation that we've seen so far. But it enforces that as well as other federal consumer protection statutes. So depending on what type of product and what type of claim you have, there's all these different government agencies that might have the jurisdiction to actually hear cases or regulate those particular areas. So you just have to be aware of what kind of product, what kind of claim you have, what's going on. Section 5 of the FTC Act prohibits unfair and deceptive practices. So if we find that companies are making deceptive claims about a product, if they're just using some type of deceptive business practice or some type of unfair business practice, then the FTC can step in. And they have a lot of remedies, a lot of tools in their belt to how to try to correct things. So these remedies include, but it's not an entire list. It includes things like issuing cease and desist orders, which means sending a letter to them saying you need to stop doing this, requiring affirmative disclosure to consumers, whether that's changing the labeling or sending out letters to existing consumers who have bought the product, corrective advertising. If we made a misleading or deceptive claim in some commercial, then we have to do another commercial to correct the misinformation. The FTC has the ability to sue companies to obtain compensation for consumers, and the list goes on, whatever just seems right in that situation. Those would be the most commonly used remedies of the FTC. Advertising is deemed to be false and deceptive under Section 5 of the FTC Act if it, then we have a list, if it contains misinformation or omits important information that is likely to mislead a, quote, reasonable consumer. This term reasonable is a term that allows a court, a judge or jury to go in and try to interpret, standards change over time. So what would a reasonable consumer expect today regarding the information and claims about a product? And they're just sort of shooting right down the middle. What should a person of reasonable intelligence know or do or be able to find out? There's no strict definition or strict model of who a reasonable consumer is, but it allows the court to go in and make a determination. I got off on a tangent about reasonable consumer there, but the next item in the list is whether or not something makes an unsubstantiated claim. An example of an unsubstantiated claim is guaranteed to reduce cancer risk if there's no evidence to the claim. Now, if I have clinical trials that prove this, then that claim would be fine. But if there is no such evidence and it doesn't seem to reduce the cancer risk, and I'm just using marketing terminology to try to convince consumers to buy my product, then a claim like that shouldn't be on there. Now, having said that, we differentiate between these unsubstantiated claims, which would be false advertising, and general sales puffery, which is a statement of opinion. It's not false or deceptive necessarily as much as it is just a statement of opinion about our own product. So my restaurant serves Gaston County's best cup of coffee. Well, I'm not aware of any objective test to find out what makes a cup of coffee the best. It's just a statement of opinion, and I'm trying to entice consumers to come down and buy my product. So what's the difference between puffery and false advertising? It usually has something to do with whether or not there is any way to objectively prove whether that statement is true versus that statement just being somebody's opinion. So that's a lot of the federal regulation. Each state has their own versions of consumer protection laws as well, with their own state agencies who are empowered to go in and regulate and seek out remedies for consumers. In North Carolina, I give you a link there to our version. It's called the Monopolies, Trusts, and Consumer Protection Act. You can read all about it. Very comprehensive. So when there is a problem with a product, you could have state as well as federal remedies, state and federal agencies that are empowered to handle those types of claims. So that's one of the powers that you have as a consumer, or there's all these different agencies you can go to report if you think that some company is doing some dirty business. From the other end, if you're a business owner, you just have to be aware of what those regulations are for your particular industry, for your particular product, to make sure you don't run afoul of these and get yourself into a very expensive lawsuit. That's our lesson for today. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise,